Okay, so the Torah. We started a new series tonight called The Story of the Torah. I'm planning that this will be about 6 weeks. So what we're going to do tonight is an overview of the Torah. I'm actually going to take you and show you the whole storyline so you get the big picture. All right? And then next week, we're going to just focus on Genesis, of what stories you're going to read about in Genesis. So, because I don't know if you're like me or not, but if you just give me a book with a bunch of words in it, I don't do well. What I need is like a visual representation, especially when you're talking about the Bible. If I had a visual representation of where this story is going and what kinds of things I'm going to be reading about, I do much better. I don't know about you. So what I want to do is I'm going to give you the big picture story tonight, and then next week we'll focus on Genesis. I'm going to do the same thing with Genesis. I'm going to use a Bible project diagram that they've made. I don't know if you've seen their Bible project posters. They make like a drawing of what's in each book. It's really good stuff. So I'm going to give you that every week so you'll have it on your phone or you can print it out or whatever. And I just want to take you through the major things you're going to find in these books so that we have a framework for what we're reading. Because the Torah, to be honest, you can get bogged down pretty quick. Like, you ever tried to read Leviticus? Yeah, no? Yeah. If you ever tried, that's probably the reason you stopped. It's because you get bogged down if you don't know what it is you're looking at and what's the reason behind it. So that's why we're doing this. So in order for us to fully understand the Old Testament, we really have to understand the purpose and the storyline of the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books. Okay? It's the foundation of the entire Old Testament. And the Old Testament is the foundation for the New Testament. Nothing new here, huh? But we forget this. Sometimes we keep reading the New Testament and we get confused. Well, it's based on Old Testament ideas. So the New Testament is just a continuation of the Old Testament story, a fulfillment of it. So that's why it's really important for us to get this. If we don't have at least a basic understanding of the Torah, we will come up with some wild and crazy ideas and interpretations for the rest of the book. So that's why we need to do this. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to answer a few common questions about the Torah. We can kind of talk about it a little bit. I'm going to show you some scripture. And then I'm going to show you a chart with the overview of the whole Torah storyline. Sound good? All right, so first question, why do we need to do this? Why is the Torah important? Well, the best answer to that is Psalm 1. And you've heard this before. You're going to hear it a lot more. Blessed is the man, this is Psalm chapter 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Okay, basic idea here, I'll simplify it. Avoid evil. You're blessed if you avoid evil, okay? But his delight is in the law of the Lord. Does anybody remember what the word Eden, like the Garden of Eden, what does the word Eden mean? Anybody remember? Delight. Okay, just store that away. But his delight is in the Torah of Yahweh. Okay, when you see, it didn't do it here in the software, but Lord there should be all caps. That's the divine name, Yahweh. Law there, the Hebrew word is Torah. So a blessed person is someone who delights in the Torah of Yahweh. And on his Torah, he meditates day and night. Now, I don't think any of us in here probably have ever spent day and night meditating on the law. And you know why you don't? Because you think the Torah is about law. The word Torah does not mean law. We're going to get to that later, okay? So the reason why we don't meditate day and night on the Torah is because we've got a misunderstanding about what it is. The Torah is not a book of law. It's 5 books that have laws in them. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, if you delight in the Torah of Yahweh and meditate on it day and night, you'll be like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in all that he does, he prospers. That sound like a tree of life? You'll be like a tree planted by streams of water. That's good for trees. You stay alive if you're by water, right? You yield fruit, which means you produce something useful, something good. And the leaf does not wither. That means eternal. It lives on. So if you meditate on the Torah day and night, according to the writer of Psalm 1, that's how you can be like a tree of life that produces eternal fruit. Pretty cool, huh? Now, if you really want to see how much the writer, one of the writers of the Psalms, loved the Torah, read Psalm 119. Just do that in your free time this week. It's a real short psalm. It's only 176 verses. And every line is about the Torah. He goes on and on and on about how much he loves the Torah. And he uses all these different words. He uses the word Torah, then he uses the word statutes, he uses the word precepts, commands, and goes on and on and on and talks about how much wisdom is in the Torah for 176 verses. That's a long song, right? So apparently the writer of Psalms, or at least of Psalm 1 and Psalm 119, loved the Torah so much that it had that much of an impact on him. So the question is, why don't we do that? Why don't we love the Torah? And it's mainly because you've been told it's just a bunch of laws. But it's much more than that. Okay? So what is the Torah? Well, I've already told you this, but the word Torah means instruction, not law. Now, there may be laws included in the instructions, but the Torah is not primarily a book of laws. It's a story that has laws in it. It's a story about the world, about a group of people, and about the covenant God had with them. And the terms of that covenant are the laws. Make sense? Okay, so when we're reading the Torah, we need to think this is a story. And these laws that I keep coming on in the Torah are related to the story. And I got to figure out how do these relate to this whole storyline, and it'll make a lot more sense to us. Okay? So, kind of a rundown of it. The Torah is the story of how God created the world to be ruled and protected by who? Humans. Remember, he created them, let us make man in our own image, let them rule and have dominion, right? So here's what the story is. God creates the world, he creates humans in his image, and he puts them in charge of the world he created. Does that mean God's not in charge? No, but it means we are somehow in charge. We have a responsibility to rule and protect the world that God made. Now, how did that go? Right. We made one chapter into the Torah and it's already failure. Right. He creates Adam and Eve in chapter 2 or 1, depending on what view you take. And by chapter 3, they're kicked out of the garden, and sin is now in the world, ruling over people, and it goes downhill from there. So in Genesis 1 to 11, which we spent the last series on for 13 weeks, you're troopers, I tell you. It tells us that humans ruled the world into ruin. That's what they did. But God did not change the fact that we have free will and the ability to rule and do things on the earth. So the result of that long term was 70 nations who are ruled by rebellious spiritual beings. That's Genesis chapter 10 and 11. So eventually, in chapter 12 of Genesis, he picks Abram. And the story really zooms in. And pretty much the rest of the Old Testament is going to be focused around the descendants of Abraham. Okay, so that's what the Torah is about. It's about Israel. Yes? The first 11 chapters is big picture, the whole world, all the nations. Zooms into Israel, and we're going to be in the world of the Israelite nation from there on out. Now, before we get into the whole storyline and the big chart that I want to show you, we need to deal with some misconceptions. because there are a lot of misconceptions about this. Okay, number one, these are misconceptions. Just want to point that out. The Torah laws tell us which sins offend God. That's a misconception. Okay, that's not true. The Torah laws are the terms of a covenant between God and Israel, not between God and the entire world. Between God and Israel. The laws that we read about are the terms of that covenant between God and Israel. It's not a list of things that offend God. It's a list of things that they're told not to do because they're unique people. And they're supposed to be a light to the nations. So they're supposed to live differently than the nations around them. Okay? So this really doesn't have much to do with what offends God and what doesn't offend God. So when we're reading the laws, we got to keep in mind, this is about God and Israel. This was not written to me. It's written for me to read and to learn about, but it wasn't written to me. That's a very important thing about the Bible you need to realize. It was written for us, but it was not written to us. It has an original context with the original people, especially the Torah. Make sense? Okay? So when we're reading it, don't think, okay, God's telling me right now what offends him, because what you're going to find out is things change. So if this law that you read about in Exodus is something that offends God, then how come Jesus comes on the scene and changes the game? Now does that not offend God anymore? Do you see the problem? So don't think of the law that way or the Torah that way. Number two, the Torah laws were for all people. We kind of already talked about that. That's a misconception. The Torah laws are not for all people. They were for Israel. Okay? You don't see anywhere in the Torah laws where it's like, okay, Israel, here are the laws for you, and then to Assyria, here are the laws for you. There's no laws in there for Assyria. There's only laws for Israel. Okay? So we're all on the same page there. Number three, the Torah laws determined individual salvation. That's a misconception. Because if that's true, everybody in ancient Israel went to hell. Why? Because nobody could obey. They didn't do a good job, right? Are y'all with me on this? Okay, the laws are not determining individual people's salvation in the land of Israel. The laws are the guardian of the nation. Here's how you are to be so that you look different from the nations around you, and the nations around you will say, who's your God? Because your nation's working better than ours. And that's the opportunity where they get to say, well, we worship Yahweh, the creator of heaven and earth. You worship Baal, who's a created being. That's why your nation doesn't work out so good, because Baal's not out for your good. He's for your destruction, right? He wants to take advantage of you. Our God loves humanity. So they were to live differently. This wasn't about individual salvation. And here's how we know that. Failure to keep the laws is factored into the law. God already knows they're going to fail, so he factors in sacrifices and something called the Day of Atonement, where all the sins of the nation would be put on one animal. One would be sacrificed. The other one would be sent out into the wilderness. And that was a way of saying sin doesn't belong here, it belongs out there. Make sense? Okay, so this is not about individual salvation. I'll give you an example of how this makes sense. Before the laws were given, we were told that faith could be credited to someone as righteousness. You know who that was? Abraham. Abraham believed God. This is Genesis chapter 15. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him or credited to him as righteousness. He believed what God said, that he was going to make a great nation out of him. He believed God, faith, and it was counted as righteousness. Does that mean Abraham wasn't a sinner? No, it meant he was faithful to Yahweh. He believed and he was loyal to Yahweh and no other God, and that was counted as righteousness. No law. Abraham didn't receive a law. So this is not about salvation. It's always been by faith. Salvation has always been by faith through God's grace. The law for Israel was their guiding principles of their nation. Make sense? Okay. As Paul said in Galatians chapter 3, he says, look, now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. It's always been about faith. Okay? All right. Number 4, the Torah is a book of laws. We kind of already talked about this, but it's a very common misconception. The Torah is a story. Just lock that down in your head. I'm going to say it repeatedly for 6 weeks. The Torah is a story, and there's laws in there, but it's a story. Okay? I'll give you a good argument of how we know this to be true. The story of the Torah mentions no laws for the first 69 chapters. That's how we know it's not a book of laws, it's a story. Because it's a story for 69 chapters before we get to the laws of the Torah. And that was at least 2,500 years after Adam. Okay? So it's a story, and we got to lock that into our brains. And then this one's really important, and we're going to move on. The Torah laws, this is a misconception. The Torah laws were God's original desire. Like, this is what God always wanted, is for a nation to obey these things in this specific law. So I'll just read you what I wrote down here. You can see them in the notes. The Torah laws were God's way of guarding and protecting Israel from complete failure. As we read the Torah, we'll notice a developing pattern. You're going to see this if you watch the Bible Project video I sent out this week, which, by the way, are y'all getting notifications on the Faith Life app when I post something? Okay. I just want to make sure, because I can't really tell on my end if anybody's seeing what I'm sending out. So I sent out a Bible Project video on the law, and they did a good job of illustrating this. As we read the Torah, you're going to notice a pattern. There's going to be laws given. They're going to fail. Then there's going to be more laws given. And then they're going to have more failure. And then there's going to be more laws given. And you see the pattern? So it doesn't just give you the law. It gives you, here's some things to follow, like 10. Here's 10 things. There's 10 commandments, and then I want you to build a tabernacle, and here's how I want you to function in that. But there's 10 commandments. And Moses goes, good. He's heading down the mountain, and what are they doing at the bottom of the mountain? They're worshiping a golden calf that they made out of their jewelry, right? And he goes to his brother Aaron, what the heck are you doing? Paraphrase. And Aaron says, well, I don't know what happened. We melted down gold, and out came a calf. You know. So Moses throws down the tablets. They break. He goes back up the mountain. Whole deal with God again. He comes back with more laws. More than 10. By the end of that process, we add them all up, we have 613. Started with 10, ended up with 613 because of multiple failures. So it's clear from the story that the original plan was, here's 10 things. But it had to progress to 613 because of sin. Okay, so when we're reading this, just be careful to remember, all right, this is God having to compensate for the sins of the people. His only other choice is to destroy them and start over. And he wants to a few times. One time in particular, he said, you know what, I think I'll just destroy all these idiots, and I'll just start with you, Moses, and start over. And you know what Moses does on Mount Sinai? He says, oh, no, don't kill them. Kill me instead. Now, can I think of another person who's going to come on the scene and offer his life instead of the lives of everyone else? Jesus. Yeah. So when you're reading the Torah, just think, okay, this is God having to deal with sin. This isn't God's original plan, his original desire. This is God having to deal with our failures. Make sense? Okay. I'll give you another New Testament passage. I'm going to try to tie in New Testament with all these. Galatians 3:24 through 26, Paul wrote this. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. We're no longer under the law. For in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. Now remember who the sons of God were in Genesis 6? The bad guys? Who are the sons of God in the New Testament? Us. We're the sons and daughters of God. We replaced them. They rebelled against God and failed. We replaced them as God's family. That's good news. Yeah? Okay, now I want to hit this question quick if I can, and then we'll talk through the storyline. Should Christians obey the laws of the Torah? Now you might think, well, that's a dumb question. Of course not. But it's actually a big debate. And it has been since Galatians. Actually, it's been that way since Acts chapter 15. And I'll get into that in just a minute. So there's this debate around, okay, do Christians have to obey the laws of the Torah? Or do we do something else? Like what's our guiding principle? So that was a debate in the early church. It's also a debate now. There are groups of people, some of them are called Messianic Jews. There's another movement called the Hebrew Roots Movement. And they believe that if you are a Christian, you have to obey the laws of the Torah. You have to eat kosher. You have to do all the things that the laws of the Torah says. Okay, so this debate started in Acts chapter 15. You probably remember this story when I start telling it because you've all heard me talk about it before. The church has just, been started up. We're 15 chapters into the story of the early church in Acts. And there's a group of Jewish people, mainly Pharisees, who have been telling people and teaching people in the church that you must be circumcised and obey the laws of the Torah, or you cannot be saved. They were teaching that to Jews and Gentiles in the churches. So what happens is the apostles in Jerusalem get together. Paul travels. Paul and Barnabas travel to this council meeting they had. And they had a meeting where they tried to figure this out. And it says there was a lot of debate. It says no small debate was done. So they had a long discussion. They were really struggling with this. Should we be telling people to obey the Torah or not? And the outcome was Peter and James spoke in this meeting, and we have their words recorded in Acts 15. But basically the argument was, look, we should not make it difficult for Gentiles to become believers. This is dumb. Peter says, hey, guess what? Neither we nor our ancestors could keep the Torah. Why are we telling them they do? We can't, and our ancestors couldn't. So the outcome of that was they gave them just a few rules. It was avoid sexual immorality, don't eat anything that's been strangled to death, and don't eat meat with the blood still in it, because if you do, that'll offend your Jewish brothers and sisters. Just avoid that, and that'll keep the peace. And they wrote a letter and sent it out to all the churches. If you're a Gentile, you don't have to obey the laws of Torah, but you need to avoid sexual immorality. You need to avoid strangled meat and meat with the blood still in it. That'll keep all your Jewish friends off your back, and it'll be happy-go-lucky. That was the plan. So I'm really confused as why there's still a debate about this, right? Because if you read Acts 15, the debate should be over. But by the time you get to Galatians, the debate's still raging. Galatians is all about a group of Jews who had been in the Galatian churches telling people they have to be circumcised and obey the law. Which, by the way, how do you get circumcised if you're not a dude? But anyway. So Paul told the Galatians, this is a false gospel. If you're telling people they have to obey the Torah, that is not the gospel. Okay? He actually tells them, if anybody, even an angel, comes to you and preaches you a gospel other than the one that Paul and Barnabas had preached to them, let him be cursed. And he goes on and on and on for 6 chapters about why that is. So you read Galatians, it's a lot of fun. Galatians is one of Paul's toughest letters. I mean, Corinthians is pretty rough, but Galatians is intense. So you can check that out. So there's a group of people today, several groups of people that think if you're going to be a Christian, you have to follow the Torah. And that's just not true. Okay, first of all, you can't. You literally can't. I'll give you an example when we get to what Jesus is about to tell us. But there's a whole section of the Torah that it is impossible to obey because there's no temple. There's a whole section of the Torah focused on how to worship in the temple. And it's gone. Been gone for almost 2,000 years. So you can't obey the Torah. So if anybody tells you, there's people in this town who are teaching people, and I see their posts on Facebook all the time, that you should be obeying the Torah, and people that aren't teaching the Torah and telling people to obey it are heretics and all this kind of stuff. You just need to know Scripture is clear on this, all right? Especially if you're a Gentile. Now, if you want to go obey the laws of the Torah, have at it. Good luck. But that's not necessary for you to be saved. Okay, our salvation is by faith, right? We're saved by grace through faith. Okay, any questions about that so far? All right. What did Jesus say about the Torah? In Matthew chapter 5, he says this, and he's very intentional to say this before he gets to his Sermon on the Mount. Or actually, he started his Sermon on the Mount in the beginning of chapter 5. He takes a break here to say, well, I probably better make sure these people understand this. And then he starts giving his own law from a mountain. Sermon on the Mount, okay? He says, look, don't think that I've come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to what? Fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota or a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So he says, look, I didn't come to abolish the Old Testament, because when he says the law and the prophets, he's referring to the whole Old Testament, the Torah and the prophets, what we call the historical books, Joshua, Judges, and Kings, and Samuel, and all that. We call those historical books. They're actually called prophets. In the original Old Testament, they were referred to as prophets. And here's why. Those books are written from the prophet's point of view. They're telling you a story from the prophets of Israel's point of view. Okay? So he's saying the law and the prophets, I'm not come to abolish them or do away with them. I've come to fulfill the story. Because the law and the prophets taught you that there's a serious problem with you. You have a sin problem and it's ruling your life. I've come to fulfill the story because the storyline ended with, when's the Messiah going to come and be the human we wish we could be? And he says, I've come to do that. So I'm not doing away with the story. I'm actually building on the story and finishing it. Make sense? Okay? Now he says, until heaven and earth pass away. Now, if you remember way back from part 1 of our Real Story of the Bible series, we talked about how heaven and earth was like together in the garden. It was like a heaven and earth spot. And then there was some separation there because of sin. And then when the tabernacle and the temple comes in, it's a heaven and earth spot. Remember that? Because where heaven meets earth. Okay? So when you read this, until heaven and earth pass away, he's talking about that spot. And that's a new way of thinking about it. But it's actually the old way of thinking about it. The heaven and earth spot was the temple. He says until that passes away, the law is still going to be in effect. Okay? But when that passes away, that era is over. That age is over. And he says it won't pass from the law until all is accomplished. Now, did Jesus accomplish anything? Yeah, all of it. The only thing not finished is his return and the new heaven and new earth, right? But everything that he came to do on the earth in his earthly mission was accomplished. That brings all new meaning to the words, it is finished, right? He goes on to say this. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, a lot of people, including myself, have read this wrong for a long time. We think he's still talking about the Torah. What he's about to do is transition into his law, Sermon on the Mount, right? All those things where he says, you've heard it said, but now I say. Those are the laws of the kingdom, the new law. So if you think of him as a new Moses, remember Moses comes out of Egypt through the waters, right? The Red Sea, through the waters, and then goes up on a mountain to get the law and give the law? Yes? Okay, Jesus in Matthew comes out of Egypt. Remember, he had to go to Egypt when he was a kid to keep from getting killed by Herod. He comes out of Egypt. He gets baptized in water. And then he goes into a wilderness. Kind of sounds like the Israelites, doesn't it? In the wilderness, going to Mount Sinai. Then he goes up on a mountain and gives a new law. When he says these commandments, he's talking about the ones he's about to give you in the Sermon on the Mount. And you say, well, I don't know if you're right on that. Well, I could be wrong. But when I read all of the early Christians for the first 300 years of Christianity, when they talk about this passage, they interpret it as these commandments refers to the following ones, not the Torah. So he says, look, the Torah is going to be here until everything's accomplished. But these commands that I'm about to give to you, if you relax them, you'll be least in the kingdom of heaven. But if you teach them to others and you do them yourself, you'll be great in the kingdom of heaven. Does that make sense? Okay. And then he had to throw this in. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. But what have we been learning on Sunday about the scribes and Pharisees? They weren't really keeping the law. They were keeping traditions that they had created, but not the Torah. Okay. Any questions on that before we dig into the story? We got a few minutes left. That's probably not enough time, but we'll see how far we get. Okay. If you'll look in the notes at the bottom, somewhere around the bottom, you're going to see this chart. And it's hard for you to see. I know I'm about to bring it up on my iPad and zoom in so we can read all this stuff. But what this is this is the 5 books of the Torah, kind of charted out with some of the main things you're going to read about as you read through the story. And this will help you get a mental framework of what the storyline is about. So give me just a second. Let me switch. Let me see if I can. That better? Y'all see that? Okay, good. I don't know if you touch the image in the app, if it brings it up bigger or not. I'm not sure. It does? Okay. Wonderful. Technology worked for a change. Okay, so whole storyline. So you've got the 5 books of the Torah. You got Genesis, Exodus, which kind of bleeds into this part, Leviticus, and then Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All right? Those are the 5 books of the Torah in order. That is the order of the story. That's why they're in that order. And it's very important that we understand what each of these sections is doing and what's going on in the story, because that helps us understand why God was doing certain things the way he was doing it. Okay? So let's zoom in here, and some of this is going to be very familiar to you if you were here during the last series. Okay, so you've got Genesis 1 through 11. We just finished a whole story on that, so I don't think we need to go back through that whole thing again. We all kind of got a framework of what was going on there. That was big picture. The whole earth, all the nations. It ends up with Tower of Babel, which we found out at the end of Deuteronomy. Moses says that at the Tower of Babel, when the nations were scattered, the sons of God were put in charge, 70 of them. And we find out by Psalm 82 that they had done a bad job, really bad job. And God judges them and says, you are sons of God, but you will die like men. They got the same sentence that humans got for sin. Yeah? Okay? So that's Genesis 1 through 11. That's given us the whole prologue of the Torah. That's the introduction to the Torah, the first 11 chapters. Then we zoom into Abraham, right? He's called Abram at the beginning of the story. And guess where Abram's living? He's in the land of Ur. U-R. And that is right next to that city that is called Eridu, or Babel. Abram is from Babylon. He's from that area. He's from a pagan place. And God calls him and says, I want you to leave Babylon. That's a bad place. I want you to leave, and I want you to go to a place that I will show you, which has always been funny to me. How do you know which direction to go? I want you to leave and go to a place that I will show you. What that means is I'm going to show you as you go. So just start going, which I would be so confused. I'd be like, there's a lot of directions to start, you know. So he goes. And what's interesting is you'll find out that Abram's dad is actually headed to the promised land. He wants to get to the land of Canaan, but it doesn't tell you why. And it says, then God calls Abram. He tells him, I'm going to take you to this place. I'm going to make a great nation out of you. I'm going to give your ancestors this land. It's going to be awesome. And that land, by the way, was, before that time, Eden. Yes? Okay, good. So make sure you remember that. All right, so you're going to read about Abram's story, and here's what you need to focus on in Abram's story. He's not perfect. He makes really bad choices, and God does not change his mind about what he wants to do with him. That's what you're supposed to get out of the story. Okay, you're supposed to get that Abram's a regular dude, and he's scared, and he has times where he doesn't do the right thing, but the thing that he never falters on is he's always loyal to Yahweh. He doesn't worship another god. He's always loyal to Yahweh. So God continues to use that. So you're going to read all kinds of stuff. He's going to get to the land of Canaan, and you're like, yeah, he got there. And then it's going to say, and there was a famine in the land, so he went down to Egypt. Like, no, right? I mean, trust God for a change. You know, just stay there. He brought you there. You ended up there. Why not trust him through the famine? But he leaves there. He goes down into Egypt. And the first thing he does when they get to Egypt, he tells his wife, look, they're going to see you. And apparently Sarah was hot because he said, when they see you, they're going to want you. And they're going to kill me because you're my wife. And that's the only way they can have you is to kill me. So we're going to say you're my sister. So he's like going to Joe Dirt the situation. You just tell them you're my sister. And then when they get there, guess what happens? They take Sarah anyway. Pharaoh takes Sarah. And that happens more than once. And then, 100 years goes, they're 100 years old, and they're like, we still hadn't had this kid that God promised us. What's going on with that? And so Sarah has the brilliant idea. She was not a modern lady, for sure. Says, you know what, I got an idea. Since I still haven't had a kid, we've got this servant that we picked up in Egypt. The story points out every time, Hagar the Egyptian. It's wanting you to notice that, okay? They took a slave from Egypt when they left. And she says, just take Hagar and have a kid with her. So that's what they do. And it's bad. It's bad for everybody. All right? So eventually Isaac, the story is finally making progress when Isaac shows up. And Isaac makes some of the same mistakes that Abram makes. Okay, he's going to do the same thing where he lies about his wife, tell him you're my sister. He's going to do the whole Joe Dirt thing, just like his daddy did, right? So you're going to see a repeated pattern as you read through that. Then you're going to get to Jacob, Esau, which leads to the story of Joseph. Joseph's story is amazing. If you read, you'll love that part because it's like twists and turns and nothing good ever happens to him until the end of his story. Right, he gets sold into slavery by his brothers. He ends up in Potiphar's house and gets falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, so he ends up in prison. And it's crazy, like he's in these really bad situations, but the writer makes sure to point out, but God was with him. And he got sold into slavery, and God was with him. And then he got into Potiphar's house. He was Potiphar's slave, and God was with him. And he gained favor with Potiphar. And then the wife was like, come lay with me, Joseph. Apparently Joseph was hot. And he says no. Eventually she falsely accuses him of sleeping with her, and he gets put in prison, and God was with him. And he gained favor with the jailers, and God was with him. And as you read, you kind of get the feeling like, man, if I was Joseph, I think I'd be like, hey, God, can you go be with somebody else? Like, my life sucks, right? I mean, I know you're with me and all, but come on. But it's a long story that ends up, he ends up basically in charge of Egypt. And guess who shows up during a famine, who's traveled to Egypt because of famine, like Abraham did? Jacob, his daddy, and all of his brothers. And who's large and in charge? Joseph. And that's the famous line. You've heard this line many times. When he reveals, hey, I'm your brother, I'm Joseph, and they're scared that he's going to kill him. And he says, no, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. God can take what you meant for evil and turn it into a good thing. Because me being in charge here has saved who knows how many people from famine because he had planned ahead and God had given him wisdom. Okay? And then the end of Genesis is going to point out to you that the descendants of Abraham who are in Egypt at the end of Genesis is 70. There's 70 of them. Why would he tell us that? Probably because it somehow relates to the 70 nations in Genesis 10, right? You'll see 70 keep popping up throughout the Torah. So Genesis ends, and then you get to Exodus. And we all think we know the Exodus story, but I promise you there's much more to it than you thought. So you're going to get, Moses gets put into it says a basket, but the word is an ark. Gets put into an ark and floated down the river, right? And he grows up in Pharaoh's home, ends up finding out who he is. He's a Hebrew, and he sees a Hebrew slave getting beat, so he kills the Egyptian guy, has to flee. The whole storyline plays out. Eventually, God calls Moses from a burning bush, from a tree that's on fire. It's something about God meeting with people at trees, You'll see that in Abraham's story. He's always by a tree somewhere. So he meets with Moses with a tree that's on fire, but it's not blowing up or burning up. And he tells Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let all of his slave labor leave. Let all the employees leave. Now, if you own a business, just think, you probably would like that to happen, until the next day. Then you would want some of them back. But what we miss in this story is it's very clear in Exodus. It tells us this a few times, that the plagues that God is bringing on Egypt, he is bringing on the gods of Egypt. And we miss that because we've always thought those gods don't exist. But they do exist. They're rebellious spiritual beings who have set themselves up as gods over nations. And they've got people to worship them as the God instead of just the Son of God. Remember that whole story? Okay? So the plagues, and when we get there, when we do Exodus in a couple weeks, I'm going to show you how this works. Every plague is related to one of the Egyptian gods that we know about. And you can see it when you look at their literature and go, this God was God of the Nile. And he was in charge of making the water clear. What does God do to the Nile? Turns it to blood. What's he doing? He's showing the Egyptians, that's not God, I'm God. That's a puny spiritual being that thinks he's something. I have power over the river. I can override your God. Right? The one with the frogs, that's related to one of their gods. The sun being turned dark. Who's the main god of Egypt? The sun god. So he turns the sun completely dark to say, I guess your God took a nap. Right? You're going to see this happen later on in the Old Testament when the prophets of Baal are going up against Elijah. I don't know if you remember this story. It's awesome. But they've got an altar set up, and there's like a whole battle between the prophets of Baal and Elijah. and they're like trying to call down their God to do something and nothing happens, and they start cutting themselves, which is common to do, and it's called bloodletting, and that somehow would get their God to act on their behalf, and nothing happened, and Elijah starts making fun of them. It's hilarious. He says, well, maybe your God's in the bathroom. Maybe he's out taking a poo. I mean, that's what he tells them, right? In different words, but that's what he's telling them. Maybe your God's out relieving himself and he can't hear you right now, right? Same thing's going on in Exodus. God is showing them, your gods are not the creator. I am. That's probably why when the Israelites left, it says a mixed multitude went with them. The word there in Hebrew is ethnic groups. Not just the Israelites left Egypt. A lot of the Egyptians went with them. Wonder why they did that? Probably because they thought, oh, your God's God. Clearly our gods are not in control. So if you're leaving, we're going with you. Right? And they did. They left. It tells us right in the text. A mixed multitude went with them. Okay? Then you have the whole Red Sea story. Everybody loves that one. God delivers his people and Pharaoh's army goes in and he drowns them all. Right? And then they've been delivered. So now they're going to go out into the wilderness, conveniently called the wilderness of sin. But the word there is not what we call sin. It's the wilderness of Zin, right? So they're in this wilderness and they're trying to get to the promised land. And what do they do in the wilderness? Complain and whine. Oh, why did you bring us out here, Moses? Did you bring us out here to die in the desert? And it would be better if we were back in Egypt. This happens over and over again in the story. It would be better, because at least in Egypt, we had meat to eat. We had water to drink. We had wine. We could party. Everything was good, right? And if you're Moses, you're thinking, you were freaking slaves. They were beating you. I killed a guy that was beating you, right? I mean, this was not the great times of Israel, okay? You were slaves, but they're like, hey, at least we had food and water. You brought us out here to starve to death and burn up. So they complain about bread. God, what does God do? He provides manna, which the word manna means, what is it? Because when they saw it, they said, what is it? They'd never seen that before. So he provides that. He tells them only collect enough for you to eat. Don't eat too much of it. You'll get sick. And then they complain they don't have water, so God provides water from a rock. They complain about meat, so he provides them birds to eat. So that's the wilderness. Chapter 16 through 18 is wilderness. Now, right now you're looking at this and going, I'm never going to remember all this. I don't want you to. I want you to print out this chart and stick it in your Bible. So when you're reading Exodus, you can open this up and go, okay, I'm reading about the wilderness in these chapters. All right, I know where I'm at. So you can know where you're at in the story. Think of this as like a timeline, okay? The last part of Exodus is Mount Sinai, is the beginning of that story. You like my Mount Sinai picture here? There's the cloud with thunder and lightning, and all the people were afraid, all right? You thought they were worshiping. No, they're scared to death. Huh? Oh, yeah. Oh, look, some of them have dresses on. Yeah. Yeah, raise the roof. Okay, so now here's what we miss. I missed this. I didn't realize this until, in the last year or so when I've been studying this stuff. This whole time at Mount Sinai is one whole year. They spent a year at the foot of the mountain getting all these laws and then failing and getting more laws and failing. Okay? So just keep that in mind as you're reading through this. This is covering these books. You're going to think, gosh, this is taking forever for me to get through these books. They could have been much longer. Okay? We're only getting a selection of what the author felt was most important for us to know. He doesn't tell us everything that happened in that year, but he tells us the important things that happened in that year that they were at the foot of Mount Sinai. So God gives a covenant with some laws, and he says, though, if you'll follow this, you get blessing. If you don't follow it, curse. Okay? That's all that comes out of disobedience is more curse. And then the whole golden calf incident, frowny face, right? And that kind of closes out Exodus. They get a whole new set of laws. Please do this. And Israel goes, yes, we will do this. Every time, that's what they say. We will do this. We will obey all that God has commanded. And we're supposed to laugh when we read that, because we know they're not going to do it. They knew they weren't going to do it. They just thought they would lie to God about it. So that's how Exodus ends. And then you get Leviticus. And Leviticus is one of the most difficult books to read because it's just law after law after law after law after law. And it's focused around the tabernacle and worship and sacrifices and all that. And we need to understand this. I didn't understand this until I heard a Christian who's a Jewish rabbi, but he's a Christian. He's a believer. He's full-blooded Jew and all that. He actually pastors a church. Well, he calls it a synagogue because that's what you have to call it over there, and in Israel, and doing great work there. But he said this one day, and I had to go track it down because I had never heard it before. He said the Levitical law is centered mainly around the priest. We kind of know that. The Levites are the priestly people. That whole section of laws was a reaction to the disobedience of Aaron's sons. So when you read that story, you're going to notice they go in, they profane the offering. They completely disregard what God had said, and they do something completely different, and God kills them on the spot because they weren't supposed to be doing that in that part of the tabernacle. The Levitical law is like a whole big response. Okay, I apparently have to be more clear about what you can and can't do in my house, because the tabernacle is God's house. So that's what Leviticus is all about. Now, here's something we really need to understand. Not all of the laws in the Torah are moral laws. Many of them are ritual laws. They have nothing to do with morality. So you're going to read weird stuff in there, like, let me find a PG one. If you've been around a dead animal, you can't go into the tent of meeting, it'll be called. That's the tabernacle. You can't just walk in there until you have purified yourself. That's why they had a huge basin of water outside in the court. And you needed to be purified, because you don't walk into God's presence with death on you. That's the point. So when you're reading all these weird laws, you need to be thinking, okay, God's the author of life, and his presence is perfect life, and he doesn't want you bringing death into that. So you have to be purified, and then you can go in, okay? So that's one of them. Ladies, at a certain time of month, you can't go in. You have to wait, because any kind of blood or fluid or anything that leaves your body that is connected with life-giving, that's considered, so hard to explain this nicely. You can't bring anything associated with non-life or death. So all those weird laws you're reading about, the whole point behind all of that is a life and death thing. Don't bring death to the author of life. Make sense? I know it's weird, but remember, it's for the Israelites, not for you. So don't think, well, I can't go to church this week, you know. That's not what we're talking about here. But that was how it was in Israel. So a lot of these are ritual laws. It wasn't an issue of morality. It's an issue of ritual purity. If you're going to come into the tent of meeting to meet with Yahweh, there's certain stipulations behind that. It's not an issue of sin or morality. It's an issue of life and death. You don't mix those two. Make sense? So you're going to read a lot of things in there, and you're going to be like, wow, why did God care about this? Why does God think this is a sin? It may not be that you're reading about sin. You might just be reading about ritual things, okay? And it's a response to sin. It's not God's original intention. It's him having to respond to the sin problem. And then Leviticus is fascinating. There's these. When we get there, I'm going to show you a whole Bible Project chart where it shows you the different movements and what's going on there. It's a lot easier to read if you've got that chart with you. Numbers is going to go. The first part of it, you're going to be like, why do I need to read this? The reason why we call it Numbers is because there's a lot of numbers in there. It's going to give you a census. Here's how many were in this tribe and how many were in this tribe and so on and so forth. And it's going to tell you how the tribes were arranged when they get to the promised land. Here's how you're going to arrange yourself in the lands. This tribe will kind of have this land, and this tribe will have this area, that kind of thing. They're still in the wilderness. And in Numbers, you're going to see 7 different rebellions. They're going to go against God 7 different times in the second part of Numbers. And God's going to respond to that. They're still in the wilderness. They're headed to the promised land at this point. They've left Mount Sinai. And what do? They start complaining about the same things they complained about before. Bread and water and all that. And meat. So Numbers ends, and then Deuteronomy begins. The word Deuteronomy is a Greek word that means second law. Because it's for the second generation. What you're going to see is in Numbers is when they get to look into the promised land. You remember this story? And they're like, oh gosh, there's giants there. We can't do this. Can't do this. There's only 2 people who said, yes, we can do it. Yahweh said we can. And they were Joshua, Caleb. Yeah. 2 guys out of the whole group of spies believed what God said. The rest of them were scared to death. There's giants there. We can't go in there. The land's just as good as God said. It's even better than we thought, but we can't do it. So what happens, the result of that is all of that generation does not get to go to the promised land. So they're going to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. That's a generation in biblical time, 40 years. So they're going to die off, but their children are going to get to go in. Deuteronomy is Moses talking to the kids. They're old enough now. It's their turn. And he's like, all right, let me remind you of the story. So when you read Deuteronomy, by the time you get there, you're going to be like, wait a minute, hadn't I read this before? It's because Moses is retelling the story to the second generation, the next generation. And you're going to read, he's going to go through the law again. He's going to give them, here's what's important. Here's what you got to obey. Blessing and curse, that's your choice, life and death. By the end of it, Moses gives this wonderful speech. He was a terrible coach. He gives this wonderful speech, and he says, look, I know you guys aren't going to do this. So keep in mind, when you don't do this and you fail, this is what's going to happen. Nations are going to overtake you. You'll be exiled. You'll be slaves again, yada, yada, yada. So he gives them this whole story, the law again, and then at the end goes, okay, you ready to go to the promised land? You're going to fail. Let's go. And then he dies. And Joshua takes over from there. That's the story of the Torah. And a very short amount of time. A lot more could be said. So, yeah, I'm telling you, the Torah is awesome, but you can't think it's a book of laws or you'll just get bogged down. Just the whole time you're reading the laws, think, okay, how does this play into the story? How does this play into the storyline? If you're in Leviticus and you get confused, go back to your chart that I'm going to give you. Be like, okay, I know what this is about now. I remember. It's going to help you as you read. This is really important because if meditating on this story day and night will make us a tree of life that produces eternal fruit, then we need to read the story. Yeah? All right. Questions? That was a lot of stuff. Overviews are long, I'm sorry. It'll be shorter next time. Well, yeah, there's different tribes, and the tribes are decided based on these sons over here. So the sons of Jacob, he had 12 sons. Each of those is a tribe. Okay? So over here, you're going to find out how many people are in each of those tribes and how they were divided up and that kind of thing. But when you get here, you're going to find out that, well, they're just going to end up dying in the desert because they don't believe that God can take them into the land. And God tells them, he's very clear, I'm going to drive out these people before you. You're going to show up like you're going to fight a battle and watch me drive them out. Some of them you'll have to fight, but you're gonna at the end of it, you're gonna be like, that was a miracle. I mean, the Jewish people are like this tall at the most at that time. They're going into a land with giants that could be possibly anywhere between 13 and 18 feet tall. So you can understand why a little short guy would walk up and kind of look in the land and go, oh, no, we ain't going in there. Yeah. Any other questions? Good. Okay, so here's your homework. Download the Bible Project app and start reading the Torah movements. Go hit the Journey tab and start it, and just have fun with it. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. You can break it up, do some in the morning, some at night, whatever. It's done really well. It's easy to do. And if you have any questions, if you run into something with that, just let me know. I'm new to it too, so I'm learning the app just like you will. But I'm pretty familiar with the storyline, so I can answer questions. If you have any, you can message me or post your question on Faith Life or whatever. That the app's going to be going much slower than what we're going to do. So it's designed, you're going to read this entire story in 2022. But it's going to go in movement. So the first movement is this. And then January 17th, they're going to release the next movement. So they've spaced it out so that you have to go slow and make sure you get it. Plus, you're going to see there's tons of stuff in there. Like, you're going to have videos you can watch. There'll be podcasts. Some of those podcasts are over an hour long. And I'm telling you, the Bible Project podcast is the best podcast on the Bible I've ever seen. Really, really good stuff. And they keep it interesting. It's not slow and boring. It's pretty interesting stuff. And I think Suzanne said, I hadn't even noticed this, but if you're doing the podcast in the Bible Project app, it has a video that's bringing up the scriptures that they're talking about while they're talking about it. So you got something to look at while they're talking, which is great. I'm kind of upset about that because I've listened to all of their podcasts without that feature, and that would have been really helpful. So the Wednesday night will not follow that directly. I mean, it's going to be much slower. I mean, we'll be done with this series, and you'll probably still be in Genesis by the end of that. So, okay. So next week we're going to do an overview of Genesis. I'm going to give you an outline, a visual picture of it, and we'll talk through. So, read Genesis this week. It doesn't take that long. It's 50 chapters, but it's not all that long. It's very interesting. It's easy to read. There's no laws. There's no weird laws. There's just really crazy stories. You've already read 1 through 11. You should know that by now. But 12 through 50 they should make movies on this stuff. It's awesome. All right, we good? Okay, if you want to hang out and talk, we'll be glad to stay as long as you want to. Let's pray.